difficult to predict. There are some epidemiologists and others working on these things, but it's an inexact science because there's so many variables that we just can't put into the model where we don't actually know the answer to these things. And this is creating a lot of havoc in flood mapping and fire mapping because things are changing at a rate that the existing models we have are not particularly predictive. And it's making a big problem. Because in the past, we may have had a pretty good idea of where the fire might go or where the flood might be. 74 Brisbane floods, good example, as I said way back then. I was a sort of star student in geography. So I was taken to see the flood maps that the Queensland government had developed. And then a few months later, I was actually seeing those flood prediction maps happen before my eyes. What a wonderful...
Hi guys, and welcome back to another episode of Rikindi. For those of you who are new, hello and welcome. My name is Alexa and I am your host. Today we're joined by Chris Miller. Chris is an emergency and business continuity manager. So thank you so much, Chris, for joining us today and welcome.
Thank you, Alexa, and welcome to your guests and attendees.
So, Chris, tell us a little bit about yourself and what got you interested in working as an emergency and business continuity manager. What exactly is that? And yes.
Yes, Alexa. Well, emergency management, I sort of fell into that because my family were involved in mountain rescuing and bushwalking and so on. My father came to Brisbane from Tasmania, where his best friend David Harvey headed up mountain rescue in the north part of Tasmania for many years and was honoured with an Order of Australia for his efforts. And my mother grew up spending most of her weekends in her teenage and 20s at O'Reilly's guest house, where, of course, it's so well known for the Stinson crash, where Bernard O'Reilly found the survivors of a plane crash and brought the remaining people to safety. It's quite heroic. Jack Thompson and various other people have starred in movies and television series about this great mountain rescue. So I grew up with stories of heroic mountain rescue and a family that was in the mountains, many holidays in the mountains. So it was sort of natural that I should fall into mountain rescue because that's what my family did. And then I joined the police and they told me I had to stop doing voluntary mountain rescue. But a few years later, they had me training police in search and rescue because they discovered I had some experience in the area. So I was back at the academy training a lot of cadets and probationaries in Queensland. And for many years, I watched various rescue opportunities on the TV and radio and thought, oh goodness, I trained that person. I hope I did a good job because somebody's life will depend on it now. So, yes, it was just sort of natural for me to be in that space. And then now I'm the national president of the Australasian Institute of Emergency Services and the first woman to have that role in 47 years. Now, in between, I got tangled up in business continuity. And that was, I came out of the Indian Ocean tsunami recovery work and the Bali bombings, and I must admit I was a bit tired and a bit burnt out because the hours were very long and complicated. So one of my bosses said, perhaps you could transition to business continuity. And I sort of went, oh, what's that? Anyway, I've discovered that business continuity is very sticky and I've been at it for 16 or 17 years. And the difference to me is emergency management is big scale. So it's trying to save large numbers of Australians or significant number of parts of Australia or Australians offshore, such as the Bali bombings and the Indian Ocean tsunami. But business continuity is a scale down. So it's still PPRR, which is preparedness, planning, response and recovery, but it's on a smaller scale. So we're trying to save a business, one business at a time. So I made the transition very easily after a 3-month trial. 16, 17 years later, I'm still at it. So it's very sticky. I'll just give people a little heads up. If you get tangled up in business continuity management, it's hard to leave because it's quite addictive and very interesting.
Wow. And I understand at the moment your main client is the World Bank. Is that correct?
Yes, the World Bank brought me into the picture, and that was almost accidental. Well, not almost, it was. One of my colleagues had been working for the World Bank, and he got a post in Italy, and now he's in Boston. And because he had to move countries, learn languages, he felt that he couldn't continue this consulting work for the World Bank. So he sort of put his thinking cap on, and he thought, oh, maybe Chris could help with that, because we'd worked together on the AMPI, the Australian Health Management Plan Pandemic Influenza. And this was a health emergency task for the World Bank. So he contacted me and said, would you be interested? And because of COVID, I just lost a big contract. So I was sort of looking for something to do, and we went through the usual, resume, interviews, yada, yada, yada. And I've been working for the World Bank since January of 22, first in Timor-Leste, then in Eswatini, which used to be called Swaziland. And I understand you know something about that neck of the woods. And then in May, I'll be in Sri Lanka doing some work for the World Bank, all in the health emergency preparedness and response space.
Wow, that is so interesting. Yeah, I've got so many questions regarding that. But just before we get into it, I'd like to ask, what exactly is the World Bank for those of the listeners who've never heard of it before, and how does it differ from the IMF?
Yes, you asked me about whether the World Bank was sort of an ATM. No. The World Bank actually funds countries, not people. And that's one of the big differences. And so does the IMF. But the IMF is involved in the stabilisation of global money activities between countries, making sure that the global economy and financial system stands up well. And like the World Bank, both of them were developed immediately after World War II. We had this conference called Bretton Woods. So for people who've studied World War II history, you'll know that name, because that was a sort of reconstruction and sort of sorting things out after World War II, because obviously Europe and Asia was a bit of a mess after a lengthy period of war. So the World Bank came to into being, and one of its first loans, I discovered when I did some research myself, was to France to help them recover from the war damage. And it's historically been the biggest loan that we've ever given, $250 million in a single loan, which seems quite gobsmacking to contemplate. Anyway, that's it. Since then, the World Bank has focused on low and middle income countries, trying to assist them in various ways with loans and grants, and providing technical advice. And that's a space where I work in a grant, which is HEPA, Health Emergency Preparedness and Response. And it's a grant, not a loan. And it has two parts. One is sort of wrapping up COVID, because there's still a need for vaccinations and the like in lower and middle income countries. They haven't vaccinated their population as extensively as we've been able to afford to do in Australia. And the second half is where I've been working, is preparing them for the next pandemic. The World Bank's actually got 5 parts, and the two that most people will be familiar with, or could be, is the International Bank of Reconstruction, IBRD, and the International Development Association, IDA. But we have 2 other parts, MEGA, IFC, and what's the other one? The International Centre for Settlement of Investments for Countries. So that's sort of somewhat like the IMF with global money management, but in this case, if there are difficulties between countries relating to investment, the World Bank has a capacity to help negotiate through those difficulties. So it's very interesting. There's 23,000 plus short-term consultants like me, and almost 20,000 staff spread all over the world. They used to joke, you joined the Navy to see the world, you join the World Bank and you see the world too. I never had any expectation of going to Africa. I had hoped to go to Timor-Leste, And I've never thought about going to Sri Lanka, but soon enough I'll be there. So join the World Bank and you never know where you'll be tasked to go.
Wow, no, that's really interesting, and thank you for clarifying that. With so you mentioned in this, you predominantly focus on in Sri Lanka, like vaccinations or preparing for the next pandemic. So is that what you're doing in Sri Lanka as well?
It's pandemic preparedness. So we're working on their health emergency management to help strengthen their planning, exercise their plans, challenge and continuously improve the confidence in their staff and in using their plans, and see if we can make them better. It's all about continuous improvement. When we do exercising in emergency management, it's not pass or fail. No. It's always about continuously improving, because no matter how good your plan is, whether it's an emergency plan or a business continuity plan, there'll always be things you missed. And often you find them the hard way when you're in a challenging set of circumstances. So this is why we encourage exercising, so you can have a practice with your plan before you discover the gaps the hard way.
So is there just like one overarching idea, like you would sit and do simulations and say, okay, well, we would predict that the next pandemic would be X, Y, and Z, and then across countries you would then make sure that those plans are implemented? Or is it that each country may have its different potential pandemic that may arise, and therefore each plan is slightly different?
Well, a pandemic's global, so each country could have an outbreak. So for instance, in the recent exercise I was involved in Africa, we were looking at cholera. And cholera is such a severe disease that one case constitutes an outbreak that must be reported to the World Health Organization. It often arises from flooding, or can even come out of from drought, but more often it's flooding. So here in Australia, we'd be familiar sometimes when we have flood situations that overwhelm our utilities, that sometimes if the sewage plant is flooded, we get told to do what's called a boil water alert. And that's a kind way of saying cholera could be a problem. So be very careful about the water. We don't tend to talk about cholera here because it sounds too scary. And thankfully it is scary and hasn't been here in a very long time, but it could arise very quickly, especially if sewage and floodwater gets together. And this is one of the reasons why you get those repeated pleas from senior emergency managers and politicians not to walk through floodwaters, not to drink the water, to be very careful with boiling the water until services are restored to a full level of safety.
Wow, that is something, particularly with the last amount of rainfall. So for those who aren't in Brisbane, we've had so much rain, and you can see that continuing. And I guess that's one of the questions I'm really curious about is, how has your role in business continuity and incident management involved with the advent of global challenges such as the pandemic, COVID, and climate change? And climate change, I guess, would tie into that flooding and the potential increase in flooding as the years pass.
Yes, indeed. And again, in some research before we met today, I looked at some of the recent media releases from the boss, from the president, Ajay Banga of the World Bank, to see, what his direction and thinking is. And a page of media releases, just about every one of them focused on climate change. So clearly it's front and centre of the leaders in the World Bank, and it comes out time and again in my work, obviously preparing for health emergency management at present, but emergency management more generally. And it's sad but true that what's happening is we're seeing some of the tropical diseases like dengue fever moving away from the equator. So as the world is warming and the flood patterns are becoming more and more unpredictable, you're seeing some of the what we might call tropical diseases moving more obviously into Australia, into Northern Australia and the like. So we will be increasingly impacted with diseases that perhaps in the past we thought were tropical diseases, which may become subtropical diseases and challenging for us too. So climate change is presenting a lot of challenges. COVID, well, it was interesting. That colleague and I that I mentioned that dragged me into the World Bank, or gave me the opportunity. We and others, obviously many others, worked on what's called AMPI, the Australian Health Management Plan Pandemic Influenza, which has had a number of iterations. And magically, when COVID came along, it got a new cover, a new name, and a few tweaks, and it was called the COVID Response Plan. By 18 February 20, when it was clear that COVID was going to be a challenge for our country too, we had a plan that was already quite well developed and had been exercised, but we moved it from influenza to COVID. So, and of course, as I mentioned to you when we met, influenza is a real risk, because if you look at the history of pandemics, it's about a 100-year cycle before another novel influenza virus hits us. And the last one was, of course, so-called Spanish flu, which came through in 1918-19 and killed more people than World War I, which is an astonishing figure to most people. Some of the data indicates it could have been as many as 50 million people. It was a very significant problem. And what happened, it sort of burnt itself out. That is, people developed immunity because they got the flu and recovered, or unfortunately, large numbers of them died. So it's likely that in the next some years, we'll have another influenza pandemic, which is a novel virus to which we have no immunity, and we'll have another challenging time.
Yeah, I understand that. Bill Gates was quite famous for being part of the whole Event 201, which was essentially, just mapping out a pandemic, like you were saying, every 100 years we're due to have one. And he has recently done one, which I think they're saying is in 2025, where he's predicting the next virus or pandemic may come. I mean, that's much shorter than 100 years. So do you think that either we're just hyper prepared now that we've realized there's so much globalization, or those influenza or predicted outbreaks are just becoming closer together? What does that look like?
Yes, you'd have to be sort of Nostradamus to know what to predict. But the best data indicates that we can expect another influenza pandemic in the foreseeable future. So I remember when we were first working on AMPI, we had a large meeting with over 100 people involved in writing the plan. The Chief Medical Officer of Australia at the time, now Professor John Hovar, briefed the writing team by saying, we are not planning for if, we are planning for when. And of course, the COVID pandemic pointed out that the when was now, but influenza and other viral diseases could still be an issue. There's no guarantee that because we survived COVID, we'll somehow magically have immunity to a novel influenza virus, and the answer is we won't.
Mm. Do you guys plan it for it naturally occurring, or do you consider it being like a case of warfare or anything like that? Or you just say when it happens, it doesn't really matter, it's just how we deal with it?
Yes, the latter. It doesn't really matter how it came about. I mean, I know there was a lot of mumbling about whether the Chinese actually developed the COVID virus and it got out of a laboratory in Wuhan or whatever the hell. It doesn't really matter to people like me in the emergency management business. It's here, it's a problem, we have to deal with it. And who generated the problem, naturally or otherwise? We got the problem immediately, and we've got to deal with it and protect our people as best as we can, as quickly as we can. And we were very fortunate with COVID in terms of getting the vaccine so remarkably quickly. And there are a number of reasons why that happened. And the previous COVID, what was called SARS, the attempts to get the vaccine against the first SARS virus, because what COVID is the second SARS virus, were manifest failures. They had to stop the trials because they're killing the monkeys, and goodness knows. So when people said to me about the second SARS, I was going, and they were saying, oh, yes, we'll have a vaccine. I was going, oh, you think? Because the data from the first SARS vaccine was a failure. But in the interim period, the science had moved on. So, for instance, we had 20 years or more the benefit of mRNA science. So a lot of people think that all came out of nowhere. No, it came out of more than 20 years of solid basic science. It was underfunded. But magically, when COVID came along, the checkbook came out, and that was pushed forward exponentially. It's amazing what you can do when you've got enough money pushed at the problem.
Yeah. How do you then deal with, I guess, vaccine pushbacks in that regard? And I understand you mentioned going to Sri Lanka and various other countries. How does the effective crisis communication tie into both, traditional social media, getting it out there to get people to want to adhere to these protocols that you guys have played out and think is effective?
Well, for instance, measles, the goal is to get 95% of people vaccinated against measles because that builds a herd immunity. You may have heard that mentioned with COVID, and it's the same sort of situation. We never expect 100% of people to be vaccinated. That won't happen because for various sound reasons of health challenges that people may already have, there'll be a proportion of the population that we can't vaccinate. But as been pointed out, particularly during COVID, for instance, say if you had an older relative that couldn't be vaccinated for some health challenge or somebody else that was, say, having chemo or some other significant, the idea was the family would get vaccinated and their loved ones, and in so doing that would provide some protection to them for lowering the risk of transmission. So again, we never expect 100%. So in future pandemics, 95 would be the gold standard because that's what we need for measles. Because actually measles is even more infectious than COVID. It's spread very quickly and very significantly. In the countries I've been working in, one of the problems hasn't been vaccine resistance. So people haven't said, no, I don't want the vaccine. It's been vaccine availability. So initially, the WHO, World Health Organization, shared about 20% of vaccine with low and middle income countries. Then they had to fund and buy the rest of it. So the 20% was targeted at frontline health workers and border people, the people that would be most likely to become directly contacted with cases travelling or in the healthcare system. So beyond that, the countries had to find their resources or borrow money to vaccinate the rest of their population. So the rates in some of these countries are still low, and part of it's to do with the economy and the availability of funds to buy more vaccine for them. So it's not vaccine resistance.
It's very interesting because and you could probably correct me if I'm wrong. It seems a lot of the first world countries are more reluctant to want to take a vaccine, question it. There seems to be a lot more news out there or information out there to make them hesitant, and then it's more about the debate on, I guess, human rights or where your sovereignty comes from. Whereas in third world countries, from what you're telling me, it seems that everyone's fighting tooth and nail to get the vaccine, isn't as concerned about what repercussions or consequences or adverse side effects they may receive.
It's a little bit different. It's even more complicated than just vaccines. I'm doing some work on dengue fever at present, and that has indicated that a lot of low and middle income countries, either the health services aren't available, they're not nearby, they're not affordable. So it's even more fundamental than that. People may use traditional medicine or traditional ways of healing, which might be helpful for less significant diseases than dengue, because about 5% of people that get dengue have to be hospitalised because they significant need of care. Most people that get dengue recover in a couple of weeks. They get a bit of a rash, they have a bit of a fever, sort of like a really bad flu, their bones ache, and then in a couple of weeks they'll sort of self-recover. If you give them paracetamol, not aspirin or ibuprofen, because that encourages some adverse side effects, but just sort of treat them with normal pain relief and just care for them like you would if you had a bad flu or bad cold, and most will recover, but about 5% do not. And one of the reasons why they need additional intervention, they need hospitalisation and more intensive care. But one of the problems with the death rate is that people are sometimes slow to come forward for care. So by the time they do come forward for the sort of medical care that we're more accustomed to, they're in a pretty poor state. So that had they come forward earlier in their illness, their prognosis would have been better. But by the time they arrive at hospital or higher levels of more modern, for want of a better term, medical care, the help they need is very significant.
Yeah, wow. I guess that's the advantage as well of doing so much travel and research into various countries, is you can really see how each individual country has this, I guess, collective way of viewing things and what they prioritize as and what they're currently dealing with. You know, and I guess just going back to it, here during COVID, it was a massive pushback. There were people protesting, you know, and really fighting against this. How do you, going back to the social media or traditional way of communication, how do you deal with this? How does the World Bank look at that? How much do they even get involved in wanting to sway people? Because I don't even know what the, I guess, cohesion or how much is the World Bank involved with the government?
We certainly fund activities in what's called risk communication. So during COVID, we certainly funded a lot of community engagement, risk communication activities, because we wanted to get the information out there so that people could make an informed choice, and in their own language or cultural ways, to make sure that the information was provided to them in a way they could understand and appreciate the choices that were available to them. So the World Bank certainly has funded that, but we fund it through the Ministry of Health in each of the countries. So the World Bank doesn't say, this is what you're going to do. We await on the advice of each of the countries as to what they see as their priorities. But quite often they see, in the documents I've seen, risk communication, community engagement, bringing in faith leaders in the community that people will feel happier receiving the information from, rather than sort of some stranger from the health department, you know, someone that they know and trust who has perhaps had more education, more formal education, so they can brief their villages and communities. A lot of the places where I've worked, like Timor, 70% of the people live in rural settings. In Eswatini, it's quite similar. A lot of people live in small villages, small farming communities, rather than larger cities, which is what we're more accustomed to. It's sort of the other way here. The majority of Australians live in a city or large town rather than the rural communities. But in Timor and in Eswatini, it's the other way around. More people live in rural settings than in cities. So when you're trying to get the information out there, sort of train the trainer type activities where you're training their leaders to understand what the options are, and that it could be adverse side effects, true. No vaccine is 100% safe or certain, but nonetheless, for instance, when I went to China many years ago, I had to have smallpox vaccination, and the doctor said, well, you know, it's only 40% effective. I said, well, 40% is better than 0%, because I will have zero immunity to smallpox, because we haven't had it in Australia for such a long time, thank goodness. But I figured when I did a risk assessment that some chance of immunity was better than no chance of immunity. So again, people will make their own risk assessments, hopefully based on scientific facts, rather than some of the unfortunate misinformation that's gone out there and all the quite extraordinary false news, false information, whatever you want to call it, which has been quite unhelpful.
What, from your research, what was the adverse side effects for the COVID vaccine within Australia or even globally, if you know offhand?
Fortunately, quite minimal compared to some vaccines. the COVID vaccine rate of adverse reaction has been on the low side compared to some of the other vaccines that we'd be more familiar with. So that's a blessing. But there still have been reports of cases of various issues. And it's possible that some of these people had underlying health conditions that even they didn't know about. For instance, one of my friends, she died at 26, had a heart attack. Now, we had no idea that there was anything wrong with an apparently healthy 26-year-old, but she came from a large family, and when they investigated what had happened to her, Shelley was her name, other members of her family had the same possibility. So they had interventions with surgery and drugs to protect them. So in a sense, her early death saved other members of her family. So there can be all sorts of unexpected things going on that may have caused some of the adverse reactions. It's difficult to know. But there have been a few in Australia, but mercifully few.
Yeah, I guess, now at the moment, it was just such an interesting time because, and I guess that's where that bridging between sovereignty and not is saying, okay, well, the research states that in order for you to protect yourself and protect your community, you get vaccinated. But then there was, people saying, okay, look, I've had other research and found other means, and I think this is not a good idea. But then you have to, so then you have security or police coming in to, I guess, enforce what the health standard has been, I guess, labeled as, or the most of the research has stated that if you have COVID, you will spread it to other people, therefore you need to be detained or protected. And so then there was this, I just saw this massive outroar of people saying, well, no, this is my right. I can't, so how do you deal with that? And I guess you just mentioned before, like making sure that you give people the access to the correct information. But coming into the next pandemic and preparing for that, which I'd love to ask what exactly you do, would you continue the same protocol of, and understand like many nurses, for example, were fired or couldn't leave unless they were vaccinated. So will that continue, or is there some, like, where is the line between your sovereignty and the protection of others? Do you make sure that you control all information, that which then becomes more of like a dictatorship, but then you're protecting? So I'm just curious how that all works.
Not my space. You need to talk to people that specialise in crisis communication.
Okay.
But I mean, from my point of view, the important thing is to get the correct information out so people can make a decision based on the facts, and consult with their medical practitioner and others who they rely on for their medical care. And if they have any other health challenges, to be very cautious to make sure that whatever their existing underlying health challenges or things that they might be dealing with at this point in time are taken into account. For instance, when I went to Africa, I got a long list of vaccinations that I was required to have. $4,000 later, I'd had what's called Operation Pincushion, as I called it myself. Now, one of the vaccinations that was on the list was tetanus. Now, I personally, when I was 7, and I'm a bit older than that now, had a very adverse reaction to a tetanus vaccine. So in the intervening years, no one gave me a tetanus shot because everyone was afraid that that adverse reaction that we had when I was very young would return. And so that was fine. Living in Australia, I managed to avoid any problems with tetanus. However, when I was going to Africa and to Timor, the risk assessment was different. So whereas previously I did not have a tetanus shot in Australia between 7 and 65, even though on many occasions it would have been recommended. Once people heard the adverse reaction, they were, whoa, no, we're not going to do that. Now, but the risk assessment changed when I was going to Africa and to Timor, where the medical care would be less available, where there could be a scratch or something that I don't even notice and have a problem very quickly. So my GP and I spent a lot of time researching it carefully and preparing me for a tetanus shot. arranging for me to have medical care. So I had it with his practice nurse under careful supervision. I stayed in his surgery for a lengthy period of time to make sure there were no adverse reactions. There wasn't, thankfully. But so the risk assessment changed for me. So it moved from don't have a tetanus shot because you could have another adverse reaction. You don't want that again. And neither did any of the medical people that I discussed it with. Oh, well, no, not for you. But going to Africa and Timor, the risk assessment was different. It was under great care and careful arrangements. We'll give it a go. And I was fine.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So just ensuring that you, as an individual, take in the right source of information to ensure that you're doing your own risk assessment. And I guess as a collective then, if each individual does that in a democratic society, then collectively you should be making the correct decision.
Yes, I encourage people to be informed. I point them to the World Health Organization, to the CDCs in the US and elsewhere, in Europe and Asia and Africa and so on. There's great information on the Commonwealth Health, Australian Government Health website. There's all sorts of information there. You can make yourself informed from the best sources that are evidence-based. So these are the people that focus on the science. They look at the publications. They compare each other. They do peer comparisons to make sure that everybody's on the same page. They can do much better than I can in terms of research. So I rely on those sources rather than X or Facebook or whatever, the Insta, possibly leading me down the wrong path. So I go to the experts whose job it is to understand these things and see what their assessment is. And they will talk about adverse reactions. I remember when I had foot surgery, my doctor said one of the adverse reactions is you could die. Right? You're just fixing my toe. And he said, because it's a general anaesthetic. I have to tell you this. So, you know, the people that are charged with our care understand the adverse reactions and will provide the best advice. So take advice from the experts.
And coming into the next pandemic, which I also find incredibly interesting. So I understand it's not if, but when. So what do you think the next pandemic will be and how are you planning for it? Like, what does that space look like?
Well, as I've said before, likely to be influenza. and many of us at one stage, it looked like we might have had COVID and influenza circulating out of China at the same time. Oh dear. But fortunately that stopped and it was just a bad flu season. But because it was so difficult to tell in the early stages between COVID and influenza, it was very worrying when we're starting to see those early reports coming out. But China's a large country, so all sorts of things can happen there when you've got a huge population with variable medical care, as I understand. So my best guess, if you were asking me to put a dollar on it, betting would be influenza, but it could be any number of other things. Again, working in Africa, I've learned a lot more about Ebola and some other really horrendous diseases that are just sort of media reports in Australia, and may they stay that way. So there could be any number of other opportunities to create havoc for us in our healthcare system and for the population. Who knows what that might be.
So when you're planning for it, are you planning for it now to say, okay, well, this could happen next year or this could happen? So like, what is your time frame or tomorrow?
We're planning for now.
For now. Okay.
Because it could happen tomorrow. We don't know. It could be developing in a country we don't know yet. But one of the reasons why we've invested a lot of effort in lower middle income countries is to strengthen their emergency management, especially their health emergency management, so that we've got what we call better surveillance, so better early warning. I often think of health surveillance as like intelligence for emergencies. If somebody could tell you, well, think of us, we know a lot about cyclones. You live in Queensland, I grew up in Queensland. You know, you see that cyclone warning and we know what to do because, you know, we've grown up with, there are cyclones, sometimes they even come down a bit south like Cyclone Deborah. Debbie and Impact in Brisbane, that's life here. So we have a measure of preparedness. So you'll hear the emergency managers leadership team saying things like secure your trampoline, make sure anything sort of that could blow around the place in your yard is secured, get it under the house, lock it down, do what you can to avoid missiles from things that might get picked up by the wind. It's similar to that. We understand how to prepare because we've grown up with it. In the health space, there are lots of things that could be done. Wearing masks in public places, just more hand washing, all sorts of little things that would be helpful that we've learned from other pandemics. It was very interesting when I met some of the people who were involved in the Spanish flu. They were quite old and they were about 6 when it hit. But it was remarkable how many of the things that they remember as a child were applicable to COVID. So we do have some ideas. It isn't a blank sheet where, oh, geez, we don't know what to do. We do have some pretty smart moves that have historically been helpful and that are likely to be helpful again in future pandemics. So these are written into the plans. Remember I mentioned AMP, the Australian Health Management Plan, Pandemic Influenza, and the COVID Response Plan. We have existing plans and they've been tested recently, courtesy of COVID. So we've learnt a lot. So for instance, the COVID Response Plan and AMP did not have a vaccination plan as part of those plans because we never anticipated we could stand up a vaccine fast enough to really make a difference. We did, courtesy of some very fine basic research with mRNA and some excellent work from the Gates Foundation and others to fund improvements on vaccine manufacture so we could make it faster than we've ever been able to make it before. And all of these things came together for a good result. Basic science, better manufacturing, got us through COVID faster. It's possible that whatever the next thing, be it novel influenza or some other thing we can't anticipate at this early stage, that those things will stand us in good stead again. Then again, maybe not. And we might have to resort to some of the older ways as the focus of our efforts, or all of those things, more hand washing, more mask wearing, more filtering of air, as well as the vaccinations. There's a whole lot of toolbox options that we need to have in place, and we need to prepare both in terms of planning and exercising. So for instance, that's why I'm going to Sri Lanka, where we're meeting regionally. So it isn't just Sri Lanka, it's other countries will be coming to Sri Lanka in the South Asia region to see if they can work together collectively, collaboratively, to come up with a plan that will join up some of their resources, will help with that early warning. So if one country starts to have a problem, they'll put their hand up fast so the others can start to get prepared, this sort of thing. So we can be on the front foot, to use a cricket analogy, and early warning, good surveillance, good laboratory, all these good things, planning, exercising, working on the plans to continuously improve them through exercising and what we call near misses or other lower grade incidents that don't become pandemics. They don't go global, but they might be an outbreak. Learning from each other so that we can be stronger in this space and be better prepared for the next pandemics because they will come.
So, I mean, there's 2 questions that spur from that, but so one is, so you mentioned that you're dealing with a lot of like the next pandemic, and you also touched on climate change and putting in infrastructure for that. Do you focus on any other emergency management like war, for example? I know that, with Russia and Ukraine, and there's talks all on the news, and I understand the news always talks about, all these possibilities, but do you touch on any of those other things, or is it mainly just climate change and pandemics?
No, we look at everything. When we did what's called a STAR assessment, which is a strategic tool that the World Health Organization has provided to countries, it's available. You can go and have a look at it on the website. Anyway, the STAR tool has helped the countries I've worked with and others to identify the hazards. What are the hazards that are most likely to impact on their countries? And that could be all number of things. And it may not be health. It may be things such as flooding or landslides or tsunami or any number of other things, and prepare for those. Now, in the health space, in health emergency management, it's sort of two parts. You've got the what you might call infectious diseases, so the things that are clearly the responsibility of health in every country as the lead agency, but also other things like flooding, landslides, multiple traffic accidents, so on. All of those things, heat waves, another one, drought and heat wave, those things health would be a major contributor to. So the superstructure of emergency management, so remember I'm president of the Australasian Institute of Emergency Services, so the superstructure of emergency management will require a significant input from health. So for instance, if you have a landslide where a village is washed down the hill or some other unpleasantness happens, chances are there'll be people that need to be rescued, that will need significant health care, that will need to have rapid response teams sent to the villages when they're pulling people out of the rubble or whatever. There will be all these sort of surge requirements from health that would have to be factored into those plans for what we might call generic disasters or community disasters where there'd be a significant demand on health services. So there's two buckets of work in the health emergency planning: infectious diseases and when there's some other significant problem in the community that might require more health inputs.
Yeah, wow, okay. And then the other question that spurs from that is you mentioning all these different countries. And so if you were like working directly for the World Health Organization, I would say, okay, well, this makes sense. But as the World Bank, which is, a banking system at the end of the day, how do you help with the whole world, or is it only countries that are involved in the World Bank? Is the World Bank involved in every country?
Well, from my research, we're tangled up with 184 countries. So that's pretty much everybody. There might be a few that we're not involved with. So countries involved with the World Bank, they're either donor countries like Australia, or they're recipient countries such as the ones that I've been working with. Now, the World Bank in the HEPA program, that is where I have been working, and again, you can look it up on Google, Health Emergency Preparedness and Response. Make sure you look at the World Bank one, not the WHO one, because that's a different program. But obviously, we work very closely together. So, for instance, when we did that big exercise in November in Africa in Eswatini, the World Health Organization provided the facilitators and evaluators and the exercise team. But because they were relying on a lot of invested money from the World Bank, I and others were there observing and evaluating the performance of the exercise so that we could write reports, so that our bosses could be assured that they got value for money for that activity. Now, the HEPA program, interestingly, the HEPA grant program is funded by Australia, Japan and Germany. So we, the Australian taxpayer, are investing in lower middle income countries preparing for the next pandemic because we know it's a smart move. If we get them better prepared, there'll be less impact on our country and our economy. So it's a sort of bit like insurance. You pay insurance and you hope you never need it. They're investing in these countries to prepare for the next pandemic and to wrap up this current one because we know that that will be protective for our country. It's an investment in protecting Australia, Japan, Germany, and the rest of the globe for that matter.
That's so, I keep saying it's so interesting, but it is so interesting because it just opens up so many more questions. So for example, I understand that we're becoming more and more homogenized or integrated with globalization. And then I could see that during COVID, you had flights that, had stopped. There was really no travel or next to no travel, was so minimal to stop the spread. But then I just see this increasing amount of, infrastructure to ensure that, as a collective species, we don't, kill each other or through various means. There's a great TED talk actually by Bill Gates, it was 8 years ago, so it was just before COVID, saying, the most threatening thing in his eyes, is not so much nuclear warfare anymore, but it's more pandemics and viruses that could wipe out humanity. But so then it just seems like there's almost like this like unified global system that's being gradually put in place. It's not one is enforcing the other or anything. It's like a natural kind of thing. You know, you as the World Bank or yourself being contracted by the World Bank, and then you have the World Health Organization and all of these global systems that are being put in place to create infrastructure that is used in every single country. And I find that really interesting because before there used to be so much separation. You know, Russia would have their own protocol and they would stick to their own stuff, and Sri Lanka would have their own stuff and they would stick to that. Whereas, am I correct in saying there really is more and more homogeny in this?
Trying to get, there is a certain amount of homogeneity, but at the same time, it's local. So, for instance, most of the countries I've been working with have got a national action plan for health security. There's a template that the WHO, the World Health Organization, provides, but then they put the data in there that matches their country, their cultural, linguistic, their circumstances. So, for instance, when I worked in Timor, the local language is called Tetum, but I discovered in time there's actually 13 versions of Tetum, which makes it really easy. Because of the mountainous character of Timor, that people have a significant dialectic difference. I noticed when I went to Germany, I studied German at high school and university even. In German, they have what they call Standard German, which is the language of education. So everybody speaks basically the same. But when I went to different places in Germany, such as Frankfurt and Heidelberg, I noticed very quickly, to my ear, there were significant differences. They were still speaking German, but there were slight variations. And in the case of Timor, you've got 13 different versions of Tetum, but as far as I understand, not a standard version like the Germans have achieved. Then the language of instruction at university and higher education there is Portuguese, because they were colonized by the Portuguese. Many of the older Timorese speak Bahasa Indonesian because the Indonesians were there for a long time. So at best, English is their fourth language. So it makes it very difficult to get information out. So, for instance, one of the things that I recommended the World Bank invest in was translating all the plans, because we had some wonderful plans that we'd worked on. Australian government, the US had been there, the US Army had been there for a big exercise. Wonderful, wonderful plans, which I could read easily, but they're all in English. So if I'm a healthcare worker in some remote part of Timor, what is this plan going to mean to me? Chances are I might speak a bit of English, but I probably don't read it, and certainly not at the sophisticated level that those plans are written in. So one of the recommendations I made was invest in translating them all, especially the operational plans, the checklists, the operational plans, that if I was a nurse or a health service person in a village in Timor, okay, what am I going to do if cholera comes, and so on? What shall I do if I suspect I've got a cholera case? How do I take the samples correctly? Because that's a real issue. How do I transport it? And for example, in the wet season, that can be a real challenge because the roads are just complete mud piles. How do I transport it to the laboratory in Dili, or that the laboratory in Dili may then have to send it to Darwin or to Perth? For instance, during COVID, the COVID samples from Timor were tested in Perth. How is all that going to happen? How do I start that process? How do I take the samples correctly? Because that's often a problem, is the samples that go to the laboratory are not correctly taken. So those kind of simple things that people need to know when they're immediately responding to some of these challenges. And it needs to be in their own language, or not just translated, but translated culturally. So it isn't just a matter of sort of getting Google Translate onto it. I don't think they offer Tetum yet, and going English to whatever, even Portuguese. It's more than that. It has to be sort of, does this make sense to someone? in this country. If we translate it directly, it may come out in a very weird way. I certainly saw that when I used to do English, German, English, Italian translations. If you make a direct translation, oh my goodness, what does it mean?
Actually, in that, I mean, I was going to say, just myself playing around with various AI platforms has been so incredible. And, I was curious how even AI may play a role in helping with crisis management, if any, at this stage. I know it's still relatively in its infancy compared to probably what it will be even in a year's time. But how does that play a role?
Indeed, we're still really trying to uncover what the role will be. And there's some AI work being done, particularly in things like fire mapping and some of the technical things where we need models really fast. And I've seen some epidemiology work where the models have been boosted in terms of speed but through AI. And even some of the COVID vaccine work was boosted by AI technology. So it's really starting to come into its own, perhaps gradually, because there's still a degree of hesitancy. But for instance, drones or UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, in emergency management, there was a lot of hesitancy about using them. But when I was in Eswatini, they were flying drones at the end of the exercise to sort of celebrate. And the use of drones now in emergency management is quite normal. Oh, of course. And who knows, in time, the same thing may happen in AI. But I think in some of the complex models, both in terms of vaccine and fire mapping and all sorts of humidity assessments, a whole lot of things that are actually really hard to do fast when you need fast answers. We'll see a lot more of that in the AI basket, I suspect. That's not to say it won't be checked by humans, but some of the grunt work of the processing to get to the models will perhaps be handed over to some of the AI modelling to move things along faster, which will protect all of us.
So what I really love about this conversation and talking to you is, you give me so much hope that there's such good people out there that are wanting to protect humanity and doing whatever they can to ensure the survival, so to speak, of the human race. But I had a conversation a little while ago with Lady Margaret and she wrote a book all about, the various destructive mechanisms. So, nanotechnology and how that's actually, it's just astounding. And even drones, you can just see like this double-edged sword of like, on one hand, you've got all these mechanisms that can really help aid humanity and protect them, but in the same breath, or you also have drones that can wipe out and kill so many people. And it's just so hard you can't, I guess, predict the future, but even this increase in globalization, it's amazing that you can start to create infrastructure to help humans when there is a crisis, but then there's also an impingement when you have, I guess, a unified planet. It's more likely that things could go wrong, or it goes in some weird direction because, there's only one way of doing things. I don't even know where I'm going with that, I guess. I don't know.
I think you're raising a good philosophical point about balancing between sort of good and evil, or good outcomes and poor outcomes of all sorts of technology. And as someone, remember, again, back to my ARES issues, which includes a lot of firefighters. If you go back to ancient times, as one colleague put it so well, in ancient times, the invention of fire, the ability for our ancestors to sort of take fire into their caves and have lighting by night and cook their food and all sorts of things, was a great piece of tech. It must have been a terrific breakthrough for our cave people ancestors. But at the same time, fire is incredibly deadly. And here in Canberra, we had the Canberra bushfires. 4 people died, 505 houses lost. We know only too well how deadly fire can be. So lots of tech over the years, and starting with fire and other things, possibly even before that. Like when motorised cars came along, you had to have flags, because lots of tech, as we've developed over the years, have had pluses and minuses. And we've had to find the path through that, the sort of moral common sense as to what the balancing act is. And AI is a great example. We'll find our way through that too. And maybe some people say the horse has bolted. Okay. But eventually we'll find a way where we can balance between the benefits and the downsides of some of these tech. And the UAVs, of course, as you've rightly pointed out, the Ukrainians have taken them to a new level in the war against Russia. But in the emergency management space, I've seen a lot of great benefits from them. For instance, we tested a pilot test here in Yass, where we had some people that were in a camping area, sort of on an island, or what became an island due to flooding. And they needed mobile phone batteries because their phones were dead. They needed some medication. Now we could put all that in a drone and fly it across. And vaccines. Whereas in the past, we would have put a swift water rescue team in, which would have endangered people to get that stuff to them. With a drone, we drew it, fly it over, there you go, drop it down, yeah, over, pick it up, go away. Got what you need for now. Terrific. And we didn't have to risk human life to get them the resources they needed. So we're seeing, but at the same time, we've all seen the amazing results from the Ukrainians with drones, with underwater drones, with in-the-air drones also, and the Russians are using the drones for very deadly effects. So what does that say? We don't use the drones when they can have some good effects, or we do use a drone? It's a balancing act. And I think this whole question of values and morality, that's a big issue that we've got to exercise our minds about, to decide as a country, as a society, what the boundaries are. What are we willing to accept in the AI space, in the drone space, whatever, and be very clear with our politicians and government what our expectations are. But we have to think about it, and we have to agree a path forward.
Because I think it was one of the theories was why we haven't seen, intelligent life permeating through the universe is maybe, or from what we've, I guess, explored, is maybe we do as a civilization reach a certain point and then we just kill ourselves, through various means. And like even with climate change, as the youth, I guess, that have grown up with this awareness, I remember when I was younger, there was a movie that came out talking about climate change, but science has been mentioning it for 20, 30, 40 years. It's not a new thing, but 50 years, maybe even longer, but nobody's really done anything. And now plastic's found in fetuses, they're found everywhere. But there seems to be no real implementation to say, hey, ban single-use plastic, or, let's start to reduce carbon emissions. And you yourself are being put in a position where you've got to help mitigate against climate change and start to create infrastructure or implementation to help people in that situation. But it seems, that's even in itself, like it's such a major problem that it doesn't seem to be acted upon. I mean, it is, but not, from my understanding, what it should be. I mean, plastic bottles should be banned.
Not enough and not soon enough, exactly. But, and of course, the frustrating thing is a lot of my business is at the bottom of the cliff. So I'm trying to deal with what happens when it's all gone catastrophically wrong. But you'll notice more and more, so for instance, the work that we're doing with Sri Lanka and 6 other countries, the objectives talk about prevention, preparedness and response. So that the objectives of that exercise are clearly stating prevention. So I'm seeing a lot more willingness. When I first came into the emergency management space, when dinosaurs ruled the world, okay. Nobody talked about prevention. No, we just dealt with whatever happened. So the 74 Brisbane flood, when I was a police cadet, nobody was talking about prevention. We were too busy responding. But more now in the exercise space, especially in the planning, I'm seeing a lot more about prevention, a lot more about mitigation. So when when you're in the post response period, when you're actually trying to understand, well, what did we learn from whatever happened and what could we do differently? I'm seeing a lot more of that mitigation coming back into the prevention space. So you're seeing a complete cycle. So we've got prevention, preparedness, response, recovery, mitigation, risk assessment, feeding back in. So we're trying to do better in that space. It's an imperfect world. Yes, single-use plastics, wouldn't it be nice if we could just wave our magic wand and they'd all be banned? But even if we do that, we've still got plastic pieces in the ocean that are going to take centuries to deal with. That's not to say we just put our hands up and say it's all too hard. No, we have to keep putting our best foot forward. And I'm always optimistic. You need to be in the emergency management space. People say to me, oh, what do you need to be a good emergency manager or business continuity manager? I say optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
I have to believe that we will find a way, no matter what happens. So no matter how good your plan is, there'll always be things you didn't anticipate that come along. Fine. But the more you plan, the more you exercise, the more you learn from near misses and outbreaks that don't become pandemics, the more we learn from each other, the better those plans will be, the stronger our preparedness will be. It won't be a 100% answer, but it's better to have a 50% answer. For instance, the Bali bombings. We didn't have a plan for whatever it was, 202 people dying, 500 and something injured, 8,000 people being flown out of Bali in the first 3 weeks after the events. But we had a national burns plan. So we had pieces of the plan. So we knew that when we got people to Darwin, where they were triaged and sent to other hospitals throughout Australia, we had a national burns plan. And we developed it not because of crazy terrorists in Bali. We developed it because of steel making. We'd anticipated that some of our steelmaking plant might have an unpleasant incident and people might be significantly burned. And how would we move them throughout Australia? And we practiced it, we had a plan. So we had part of the plan. So this is often you don't have the whole plan, but you need to get some of the pieces in place and you need to build confidence. I was just talking to my World Bank colleague in London about the Sri Lankan thing. And I said, it's all about confidence building. So even if the plan doesn't exist, even if you have no plan at all, if your people are being exercised, if they network with people who can help them, if you get the right people in the room, hey presto, you'll start to come out with some pretty good ideas and solutions. If you got a plan, that's a bonus. Or if you got part of the plan, that's a bonus. But you must be optimistic that no matter what happens, you'll find a way forward. And I believe that even if climate change completely wrecks the planet, which I have a bad feeling it's doing that, there'll still be people that'll find a way through. So when all this mess possibly kills a significant proportion of the population of the globe, which I hope it doesn't, but I suspect it might, there will be some people who will make it through and they'll be the hardy ones and they'll find new ways of getting over some of these challenges. So we have to be optimistic. Hopefully we won't wipe everybody out, but I suspect we may kill more people than we need to, and climate change is sort of heading that way. As I mentioned about those tropical diseases, they're coming south, they're moving north, and there's not much we can do about it. Even if we stop burning every piece of coal or whatever, oil or anything, it's not going to stop that. That's happening now. It's coming.
In Brisbane, just to be localized, what, when, like, or even globally, do you think that, so this year it's already started last year, the year before, and at what stage do you think it's going to get really serious? Like next year, the year after? What is our time frame before things?
Difficult to predict. There are some epidemiologists and others working on these things, but it's an inexact science because there's so many variables that we just can't put into the model where we don't actually know the answer to these things. And this is creating a lot of havoc in flood mapping and fire mapping because things are changing at a rate that the existing models we have are not particularly predictive. and it's making a big problem. Because in the past, we may have had a pretty good idea of where the fire might go or where the flood might be. 74 Brisbane floods, good example, as I said way back then. I was a sort of star student in geography, so I was taken to see the flood maps that the Queensland government had developed. And then a few months later, I was actually seeing those flood prediction maps happen before my eyes. As a police cadet, I wasn't a police officer at the time. I was just a cadet. But seeing it all unfold exactly as those maps, or so close to what I recall seeing only a few months before, because Brisbane floods in pockets. It doesn't flood sort of universally because there's higher and lower bits. It was alarming, but at the time I was just too busy trying to help people get out of their homes and not die in the floods to worry about those small details. But many times I reflected that we had a pretty good idea of what was coming.
I like the optimism. So I guess this does really tie into this. I feel like you've already answered it, but why is business continuity so important?
Oh, yes. Well, as I said, business continuity is small scale. It's about trying to protect a business. Now, we know that businesses, and this is according to the Global Business Continuity Institute, that businesses that do not have a business continuity plan and get involved in some sort of significant challenge and disruption to their business, 75% of them are out of business 2 years later. So it's a difference between having a business and not having a business. Now, that doesn't mean you need some sort of elaborate plan that reads like War and Peace. Depending on the nature of your business, it could be just a couple of pages, but you need to have a checklist. You need to have thought about it. So I often sort of have lunchtime meetings with smaller businesses and say, have a think about it. For instance, do you have everybody's phone number in your phone? If you're a small business, say there's just a few people, 10 or so, can you contact everyone? And there's usually a bit of maybe going on. Perhaps the head of HR does. But there can be simple things that you can do, even with a small business, to help them prepare. You don't need to fund elaborate and expensive creatures like me. You can just start to prepare with a simple checklist. And also what I've noticed over the years, so there can be some preparedness things, such as getting everybody's phone number in your phone if you've got a small business. So, for instance, when my father's business was flooding in the 74 floods, we were all there taking drawings out, lashing welders to the roof. We could contact people so that we could bring the team in to prepare the business as quickly as possible. So that's preparedness. Then we had a capacity to respond because we had all the people that we could possibly get there helping. We were watching the floodwater literally come up the road. Where my father's business was located, it was at Salisbury, and usually it was sort of a little creek of muddy ponds, and all of a sudden it was a raging torrent that looked like something out of some Wild Rapids movie. It was quite astonishing, and we were watching the water come up the road at his business. But because they'd prepared, because they knew how to contact the staff, they could bring them in, and everybody could, put all hands to the pump and protect his business. And they were back in business relatively soon after the flood because they were ready. And that helped other businesses because he was in the maintenance engineering space. So there were other people who needed help with restoring their machinery, but because his business could get back quickly, they were able to help their clients and other customers. So it's very organic now. The whole world is connected. So as you pointed out, with the global supply chains, global aviation, lots of businesses have dependencies on each other. So I often encourage people to also think about who and what do you depend on? Who has to help you do whatever it is you do? And who and what depends on you? And are any of these people annoyingly litigious? So if you don't do it, and they're going to sue you. smart move is getting ready. So business continuity is sort of in the insurance space. Businesses insure their property and vehicles and people, business interruption. But most business interruption policies don't pay for at least 6 weeks. What are you going to do in your business when you've got 6 weeks negative cash flow? That is, you'll be paying more out for fixing, but you'll be getting less money in. All those, thinking your way through those things. It's scary. I know. I've spoken to a lot of quite senior people who've looked very pale when I finished my lunchtime meeting with them, because they realise how vulnerable they are. But as I often say to people, every moment you spend thinking about preparing your business for whatever gets you in a better state of preparedness, because you're getting yourself in the headspace to help your business. And even if all you do is get your contact lists in the phone, great, good start. But then move forward into that sort of business process mapping, thinking about who and what do you depend on, and who and what depends on you, and how is that going to impact on your business. So looking particularly at your bottom line, so things like which of these activities contributes most to my bottom line. You want to get that back up first. So if X contributes 80% to your bottom line, well, that's the one, that's the first priority. And the 20%, well, they can wait.
No, that's really good advice, actually. And as a small business owner myself, I don't even have a business continuity plan. So I can see how that is important, and I should definitely start thinking about it and write it out. So what are the biggest challenges in mentoring new business continuity managers, and how do you address them?
Yes, well, I've thought a lot about this because I mentor business continuity managers now. You won't be surprised to hear. But when I started, I mean, as I said, this boss or deputy CEO asked me to move from big scale emergency management across to business continuity management for his business. And I went, what that? Truly, I did. I didn't know what he was talking about. He explained it a bit, and then he said, oh, don't worry, we've got some mentors. So I was actually mentored by one of the big four, and they brought people in who genuinely did know about business, thank goodness. But I was sort of the liaison between the business and the big four that we brought in to consult with us. But then gradually, as I started to, and one of their requirements was skills transfer. They were supposed to train me to take over. And gradually, as I started to understand more of what all this black box business continuity was about, then there was less for them to do and more for me to do. But even then, that mentor and I are still in touch all these years later, and occasionally toss ideas at each other, because he's still in that space and I am too. So business continuity managers are pretty good networkers with each other, because we know we need advice. And especially if you're a new business continuity manager, one of my fastest advice for you will be find a mentor, maybe a couple, and do the Business Continuity Institute training or the DRI training. There are two accrediting bodies globally, the Business Continuity Institute based out of London and the Disaster Recovery Institute International based in New York. And they accredit business continuity managers globally. And that will give you a good foundation. So find a mentor to get you started. And if you can get the funding to do the training, because unfortunately it is a bit expensive, then that will stand you in really good stead to get you started, because often internal business continuity managers are like me. Well, what's that? They're just thrown in the deep end. So get some help. And also join some of the networking activities. So, for instance, the Business Continuity Institute of Australasia holds frequent webinars with very experienced colleagues sharing things. They have report webinars because they do reports, global reports on crisis communications, various other things that we need to know more about, and attend those webinars and face-to-face meetings if you can. Network, because you will need, as one of my colleagues puts it, you'll need a lot of 4 a.m. friends.
Awesome. And is business continuity planning a good career option for young professionals?
Sure is. Absolutely. As I've often explained to my mentorees, it gives you an understanding of the whole business. You have to understand everything in the business, but at a veneer, at a sliver, which there will be people will be expert in their particular business process. But as the business continuity manager, you need to know where your pain points are. So you need to understand the whole business. And usually the only people in the business that do that are the chief operating officer, the chief risk officer, the CEO. So you get wonderful training to become the CEO in the future because you will understand the totality of that business, but at a thin level, not at a detailed level. You need the subject matter experts to help you there, and they will help you develop the recovery procedures for their part of the business. As I often say to those subject matter experts, because knowledge is power, and sometimes people are a little hesitant to fill in my templates. So I say to them, okay, what if you were unavailable for 6 weeks and something happened? Wouldn't you like a little plan so that the people that are here that are less expert than you will know what to do? And I remember talking to someone that ran a very big plant. He was a senior engineer. I said to him, when is your plant? This was a 24/7 type plant. I said, when is something most likely to go wrong in your plant? And he said, 2:00 in the morning. I said, are you here then? He said, of course not. That's why I got promoted. So I don't have to be here at 2:00 in the morning. I said, yeah, right. Now, so you've got a junior engineer or somebody like that, or junior engineering team running this enormous plant. Is there something that they could do, not understanding the complexity as you do, that like stop something or do something that could actually create quite a lot of fixing time for you? He thought for a moment. He said, I can think of several things that would take me months to repair that they might think was the good move. And I said, yeah, right. So here, write a checklist of the things you want them to do and the things you don't want them to do until you or one of the senior managers can be here. So give them at least sort of a 4-hour checklist, or whatever you think is reasonable, 24-hour checklist, because the cavalry will come riding over the hill if you've got a significant disruption. But you just need to get people started, and they need to understand what they should do, but also what they shouldn't do. He said, before you came along, I thought all this business continuity was some sort of corporate, so I won't say what he said, inconvenience. Now I see the point. Isn't that good? I got through to you. And he said, yes, you are the daughter of a maintenance engineer. You can talk to an engineer. You must have been listening when you were growing up. I said, oh, yes, I tried. Because I did used to trot around following my dad as he dealt with disrupted plants in all sorts of ways. So maybe I fell into business continuity from his work, helping people get their businesses back together, but in a kind of physical and mechanical sense. Now it's a sort of documentation and preparedness sense for me.
And on such a global scale as well. I mean, the work you're doing is really important. I guess this is also, we've kind of covered it anyway, but what is the difference between business continuity and disaster recovery, and which requires more attention, if any?
Well, depends on what you're talking about there. So emergency management, some people sometimes call it disaster recovery, but for a business continuity manager, that's usually the IT subplane. So disaster recovery tends to get in the box called IT. So you get IT DRP, your information technology disaster recovery plan, which is a subset of your business continuity plan. Now, a lot of people make the mistake that if there's a cyber attack, for instance, they think, oh, that's a tech problem. No, it's not. It's a business problem.
Okay.
Because while your tech is down, your business is disrupted. Because there are not too many businesses now that have what we call manual workarounds. That's a distant memory. It's gone. So I often say to businesses, okay, if this piece of tech is down, this platform, this application, this whatever it is, can you do anything? Is there anything possible you can do while it's down? And often the answer is no. Okay, send everyone home and let the tech people sort it out under their disaster recovery plan. And then once they get that stood up and tested, because that's the other thing, it's all very well to get it working again, but it needs to be tested before it goes back into a production environment. Then how's it going? And you need to monitor it thereafter. So disaster recovery to a business continuity manager is the bucket called IT. And the
Noted.
business continuity part is all of the business. So, but the focus is on what we call the most time critical business processes. So which of your many things that you do in this business are going to impact most on your bottom line? They're going to hurt people. For instance, I've worked in the health sector. Don't want to kill patients or your staff. So there's lots of risks. So we look at the risk framework that the business has as a way of trying to identify which of your business processes are the most vulnerable and what could you do about it. So in business continuity, there's two halves, as I said. One is, how do we make your business less likely to fail? And what are we going to do if bits of it are failing? So it's two halves. So we also think of it as a continuum. So a lot of businesses have what we call elasticity. So their business as usual has a certain amount of elasticity. And you see that in property, IT, HR, work health and safety. So those parts of the business often suffer disruptions on a lower scale than you would necessarily switch on your business continuity plan for. So they have a certain amount of elasticity where they can reach out and deal with the latest challenge and bring that into business as usual. The business continuity plan gets switched on when that's too much, when you have multiple things going wrong simultaneously, or it's of such a scale or likely to be such a long-term problem. For instance, if you've got a factory fire, you're looking at your factory in ruins, you're not going to fix that too quickly. If you've got business interruption insurance, as I used to work for an insurance company, they're not going to pay you out for a long time because so many factory fires are insurance claims, not legitimate fires. So the insurance companies are very hesitant to pay out on those type of fires. So you'll find yourself in a very difficult position again of high cash flow out, no cash flow in. Then what? Do you just say, look, it's all too hard and fold up your tent and close your business? In which case your business interruption insurance payout will be much lower because you need your business to continue to get a proper payout on your business interruption insurance. Another reason why you need a business continuity plan.
I can definitely see the importance, and this has been such an interesting discussion. I guess we did the opposite way round by starting quite broad and talking about what you're doing on a global scale, and then drawing it back to an individual business from small, medium, large, and it is very interesting. Really putting in that infrastructure to prepare for the worst case scenario. So I really appreciate your time, Chris. And one question I love to ask, everyone being obviously a podcast, is what message would you share with the world?
Yes, I saw this question and I thought, geez. I think the final word I'd offer is back yourself. Say yes. I mean, a lot of these opportunities that I've had in my career have been reckless yeses. I mean, I didn't know much about the World Bank. I thought I was just helping a friend. And then all of a sudden, oh, you're going to Africa. Huh? What? Initially, it was all virtual because COVID was on. And there was no mention of going anywhere. It was just, all virtual meetings. So, oh, yeah, I can manage that. Next thing, no, you're on a plane. You're going to Africa. Huh? So back yourself. Say yes. Don't get tangled up in that nasty imposter syndrome. That doesn't help you at all. That will damage your career. Remember that the person that's asking you to do something, especially if it's a credible person, they think you can do it. They believe you can do the job, the challenge that you're being set. So have a go. What's the worst you can do? Fail? Okay. I mean, fail is a great opportunity to learn a lesson. And this is what we do a lot of in the emergency management business. For instance, that New South Wales coroner that recently reported on the Black Summer bushfire. Nobody wants 25 people to die again. Of course not. And 7 of them were emergency responders. Terrible thing. So we want to learn from what happened and see if we can make a sharper plan. And there's nearly 30 recommendations in that report. A lot of them about aviation, firefighting and communications, how we could, and risk assessment, how we could do that better. So yeah, take it as an opportunity. Even if you fail, you'll learn a lot.
So wise. And I really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you so much, Chris, for joining us today. And thank you everyone for listening. I hope that you've taken as much valuable information as I have from this.
Thank you very much.